Okay, we are back. So, my plan today is to watch some more of this interview with Bernardo Kastrup. Um, oh man, it's been a rough morning so far. Woke up with a migraine, allergy attack, not feeling super fantastic, but hopefully it won't impede me too much. And luckily, I'm already functioning at a low level, so this isn't going to affect too much overall. But anyway, if you haven't seen the first part of this, where I looked at the first, I don't know, few minutes of this, there's already a kind of very interesting discussion going on in that video. I'll put a link to it in the description. I guess that's what I'm supposed to do. Allergies. Oh goodness. Anyway, so I haven't watched any more since I left off yesterday, and it's kind of paused right where I left it. Actually, I think they were talking about the phenomenal concept strategy. But let's just back it up a little bit. Forget. This is, let's see where we are. So we talked about the meta problem of consciousness, and they were just, so I was only here. Phenomenal concept strategy. And then there's some other stuff. I want to get down to this Dennett and Frankish and Illusionism and Strawson. Looks like some interesting stuff down there. And then Sean Carroll way down the way. So maybe I'll jump around a little bit. I don't know. Maybe I'll watch it right through. But we'll see how it goes. Okay, let's see here.
It is a fact that ultimately all we have to construct an ontology is our epistemology. Have
Okay, hold
to
on. So what is
ultimately
he?
it is astray to begin with, and people do that when they are emotionally committed and even socially committed to a certain perspective. That has happened throughout history. Our time is no exception to that. Look, ultimately, it is a fact that ultimately all we have to construct an ontology is our epistemology. It's all we have. And this is acknowledged as a limitation of human beings. We do not have direct access to reality as it is. We are cooped up in our models of reality, in our theory making, our hypotheses, our conceptual armor, and so forth. So yes, there is a distinction there, and there is a gap, and that gap can be appealed to if one is um, determined to avoid the natural conclusions of reasoning and evidence. If you really want to stick to something that doesn't hold any water, you can always appeal to that and say, well, your argument is excellent, but it's epistemic. And ontology may be different from our knowledge of the world, different from our epistemology. Yes, congratulations, that's always the case. So you can always appeal to this, but that's not the game. The game is having acknowledged the limitations of epistemology, the limitations of what we can know. The game is to come up with the most plausible, the most viable model of nature, model of.
All right, so let me just stop him right there. So, like I was saying in the previous video, I admire and respect Bernardo's work. Not always the way he approaches these things, but definitely the argument involved. So the first point he's making, I take as common ground between many physicalists and many idealists, which is that we start from experience. Okay, but the interesting thing to me is that the idealist, like Bernardo, thinks there is something external to the mind, and you arrive at that from experience to a conclusion that there must be something external to the mind. The question is what the nature of that external stuff is. That's really the ultimate debate, it seems to me. And the physicalist says it's not mental, and the idealist says it is mental. The analytical idealist, anyway. So they both agree that there's some reason to think that there's something external to the mind. What I don't like is when he says that it doesn't hold water to think that this external to the mind thing might not be itself mental. We have some reason to think that it's not mental. Maybe there's some reason to think it is mental, although I'm skeptical of that reason. But to deny it as a to portray it as a denial of where the reasoning leads to, I think is just disingenuous. So the background difference in the psychological attitude of the relevant parties is over how serious we should take reasoning itself. So one side thinks that reasoning to a certain conclusion is not the final arbiter of the truth of that conclusion, because it would depend on experience. So that's the kind of empiricist attitude, and the neo-Quinian, if we want to use fancy words, kind of idea that philosophy is continuous with the sciences kind of leads us in this direction. So on the other side, of course, are the kind of more rationalist approach that thinks that there's something that we can know about the fundamental nature of reality by reasoning about it. And that's why the arguments against physicalism are a priori. And Bernardo's appealing to the heart problem and all those things here as a reason to doubt physicalism. And so the persons who think it's just an epistemic gap, I don't think that they're trying to deny some obvious truth. They just have a different approach to understanding how reason and reality relate to each other. So that, granted, all we have is experience. The question is whether we should, take this idea that there seems to some people to be something so hard to understand about how consciousness could be physical, to take that as a reason to think that consciousness really isn't physical. As I've said previously, I take that as a reason to explore other views and for people to develop those views and so forth. So I think nothing wrong with that, but I think it's a bit strange to put things the way that Bernardo is putting it here. But that again betrays a different a difference in the background assumption about how reason and experience works. And I have to admit, sometimes I'm very much on the side of the rationalists, and other sides I'm not. So I see both sides of the issue, so to speak, but I don't think Bernardo does. But listen,
Ontology
finish.
model of reality as it is in itself. And sometimes we have good reasons to rule out some hypotheses. But if some people do not want to rule out those hypotheses, then they will always point to that gap between our knowledge of nature and nature as it is in itself, in order to say, well, but there is still a possibility that I am right. Well, there is, but you see, there is a possibility that there is a flying spaghetti monster moving the planets around their orbits. I cannot refute that categorically because there may be higher dimensions.
I mean, so that's not, I think that's a bit unfair. Um, it's not quite the same. Obviously, there's to just posit something which you could never have. Well, the flying spaghetti monster. Wait, is he going to try to define it as something which, by definition, is not observable? Let's see. Hold on. Let me let him finish before I jump in here.
Orbits. I cannot refute that categorically because there may be higher dimensions, and the spaghetti monster is hiding under higher dimensions, and it's using its noodly appendages to move the planets around the sun because of some gravity leak across the dimensions, which is theoretically consistent. And the evidence is consistent with the hypothesis. The planets do move around the sun. So look, the game is never what hypothesis could, in principle, be true. The flying spaghetti monster could be true. It could be true that there is a teapot in the orbit of Saturn because aliens stole it from an old lady's living room in the 19th century. On their way home, they got bored of the teapot and dumped it, and it got caught in the gravity well of Saturn. So most silly hypotheses, if not all, cannot be categorically ruled out. You can always come up with a implausible.
So see, this is true, but I think it's materialism is not a silly hypothesis in that sense. I mean, I understand why maybe someone like Bernardo has to come out swinging so hard against materialism or physicalism, because as someone who defends idealism, they must get a lot of ridicule, people thinking that obviously physicalism is true or something like that. So I could see why you would become defensive and start maybe harboring a bit of a grudge against that kind of naive rejection. But that doesn't characterize physicalism. It may characterize some naive physicalists, I guess, but analytical idealism and physicalism are two views about the ultimate nature of reality and how they relate to the mental. There are well known arguments on both sides. So I don't really think it's fair to say that one is silly. It's just to say that you find one more plausible because of these various arguments. The other side doesn't find it plausible because of various other arguments. So I don't know why we need all this other stuff. But anyway, the name calling and stuff like that, I don't know how that helps. Except for in the sense of I could see why if you like feel like people have been unfairly biased against you, you want to be unfairly biased against them.
Plausible, inflationary, convoluted story to justify them. One of these convoluted stories being the gap between epistemology and ontology. We can always do that, but we
That's
do.
not a convoluted story, by the way. The gap between epistemology and metaphysics is, first of all, common sense. Many people commonsensically arrive at the idea that what does epistemology have to do with metaphysics? The fact that you can conceive or imagine something and then say that something is true strikes many people as odd. And I still find it to be a bit odd that you could find out the nature of reality simply by reasoning about it. I tried to highlight that with my Schombe argument by saying that I could conceive of consciousness being physical. So therefore, what, dualism is false? No one thinks that's a good argument. But I think it exactly mirrors the conceivability arguments on the other side. So I don't really know why, a personal intuition that a person has about the nature of consciousness or reality has to be taken to the point where it's like, anyway, I'll start ranting about this. I'm not saying anything constructive.
Seriously entertain most of these silly hypotheses because we do think that there is some valid structure to reason and evidence, despite the epistemology ontology gap. And that's what guides us to more plausible alternatives, or that's what guides us to not take seriously.
Right. So I forget what I was saying, but the thing I was trying to say was that there's good reason to think that there is really a gap between epistemology and metaphysics. And you can just look at the history of philosophy for those who sort of fall on one side or the other about what they think reason can and can't do. So there's just, some people are empiricists. I don't think that makes them in denial about consciousness or something. Um, anyway,
Silly alternatives that can actually not be ruled out definitively. That's the game. How can we be less wrong? How can we increase the confidence of our theorizing? How can we get closer to truth? And the criteria for
yeah, see, so I would disagree with that as well. So my own view is that what we should be doing is mapping all the space here, the different views that there are, and the argument structures that point in one direction, and then also the empirical stuff, so that in the fullness of time, we always have this grand map of all the positions, arguments, and evidence, and then we could do the kind of weighing thing that he's talking about. But I don't think we're in a position to get at the truth right now, and I think it's a bit premature to say that what we're trying to do is get at the truth. What we're trying to do is understand the options. I don't think we really have fully even reached that point, but that's me.
that are very clear and they apply regardless of the epistemology ontology gap.
Yeah, precisely. And I think that's why I like to call it a cope sometimes, because it's this retreat. We don't have like the digestive concept strategy or something like that. And they maybe say, well, that's because we can reduce digestion. And I go, exactly. If you could reduce consciousness, you wouldn't have this concept strategy. It would just be like everything else that you reduce. So I
Yeah.
just think it's a very ironic. So yeah, so go ahead, Kyle. You have another good question here.
But it's not that ironic, actually, Mr. Sir, because the bulk of those who accept a phenomenal concept strategy also try to argue that there's something about consciousness that makes this plausible. So everybody's going to have to say something about phenomenal concepts. We do have consciousness and we do have the ability to think about it, form concepts about our experience. So everybody has to say something about it. And it's just part of kind of regular empiricism that some concepts are acquired from experience. All the way full-blooded empiricism says every concept is acquired from experience. But I mean, I've never met, it's very rare to meet someone who says like concepts like color and pain are not acquired from your own experience of color and painful experiences. So this is how we acquire them in a unique way. We don't acquire other concepts in that way, that requires having the experience. So there's something unique or interesting going on here. And the phenomenal concept strategy is one way to try to understand that we pick out these experiences by something like a demonstrative, a pointing, or a quoting or a grabbing of the experience in some way that doesn't conceptualize it or something like that. So, I've never myself endorsed that view, but I don't think it's a coping strategy. It's just a way of trying to explain why there wouldn't be deductive links between these concepts and other ones. The people who really take this seriously try to show that it's similar to like how in other indexicals and demonstratives work. You can't infer from I am here now where I am exactly, etc. Blah blah blah. So I think it's a lot. I don't really like these partisan games where they, try to paint the other side as silly. I think that all of this is very confusing, and you may not like some of the options, but I'm more interested in the arguments. And so far, what argument have they presented? Just the hard problem? I don't really see anyone defending any arguments here. But this is an interview, so we'll get back to it.
I was going to say a lot of those things are going to be brought up in after this one because a lot of illusionists lately and eliminativists are doing that exactly. They're bringing about modus tollens and other logical fallacies. But anyways, we'll get to that in a second.
Modus tollens is not a logical fallacy, but I mean, first of all, I'm not an illusionist. I don't endorse illusionism. I don't much even like illusionism. I try to understand illusionism and illusionists, and I've talked to them and find it frustrating sometimes, and so I can see where the frustration comes from. But I don't recommend illusionism as a response to any of this stuff. But I don't know what. Yeah. Anyway, so let's let this continue.
The next one is just David Pearce. So he's a British idealist philosopher. He calls this view non-materialist physicalism, but it's idealism. He thinks that so one of the things with cosmopsychism and analytic idealism, etc., is you get a cosmic mind at the end of it. It's a logical endpoint. But he says he's expressed some concerns that decoherence threatens.
By the way, so this is the point where I feel like things are like inside out because we just spent all this time talking about how silly it is to talk about materialism. And then it's a logical consequence of these views that there's a cosmic mind. Okay, so I don't think that's silly or any more silly than materialism. So if the idea that minds are simply identical to brains is silly, then why isn't the idea that there's a cosmic mind silly as well? What's the criterion for silliness here? That there's an argument against the view that you endorse and other people reject. So this is the part where I just like, okay, so you accept this hard problem as a starting point, and then you want to build theories about what would be true if the hard problem were like the way people think that it is, that there really were some unbridgeable gap and some non-physical aspect. So I think that's a notable and worthwhile activity, but I don't think it merits all this other rhetoric. That's my personal view.
The unified cosmic mind. So just quickly, I know you know what decoherence is, but some of our listeners probably don't.
By the way, the unified cosmic mind, if the multiverse is true, then aren't there multiple of these, right? I've asked, like I asked Philip Goff this one time. I don't think he ever responded adequately to it, but it does seem like if you take the multiverse and you really take this cosmic mind stuff seriously, then there's a lot of interesting things going on here that no one's discussed. But anyway,
It's basically a view that can be viewed as the loss of information from a system into the environment. So often modeled as like a heat bath or something they would call it. So since every system is loosely coupled with its energetic state of its surroundings, so if it's viewed in isolation, the system's dynamics are non-unitary, and although they're combined, system plus the environment evolves in a unitary fashion that utilizes its information. Anyway, it's a little more than that, but yeah.
Okay. Um, Decoherence is a merely operational notion. It
yeah,
is
that's
not a
true.
fundamental notion. So, what is decoherence? When you have a quantum system in a superposition, that's a coherent system, let's call it that way. It's in a superposition. It's not in a defined classical state. It's in a superposition of possible states. That's what characterizes a pure quantum system. Usually they are microscopic. When you make a measurement on that system, we say that it collapses. Collapse is another operational concept. It may not be a fundamental thing. There may be no collapse at all, but operationally, things happen as if there were a collapse, because instead of a superposition of possible outcomes, now we have a defined, measured outcome. And that happens when a pure quantum system in a superposition interacts with the classical environment, like the measurement probe. And then the information that was contained in the superposition, because of that interaction with the classical environment around it, leaks into the environment and becomes inaccessible. Now, this is an important point. It becomes inaccessible, it doesn't disappear. The information didn't fundamentally evaporate. It has become inaccessible because it now is diluted in a much bigger classical environment. It's like
All
dropping.
right. I mean, I'm going to come back and I'm going to skip this for now because I do like his talking about quantum mechanics, but I don't see how it's really related to this other stuff. Well, let me hear how it gets to the cosmic mind.
A little drop of black ink in the ocean, it doesn't disappear. It's all still there, but it's diluted and you no longer can see it. It becomes unrecognizable. So the information, quote, loss in decoherence is not necessarily a loss. It depends on how you interpret decoherence. But if you approach it in the most rigorous way possible, you cannot speak of a loss. You have to speak of that information becoming inaccessible. We can go into the math of it, and you see that what I'm saying holds water. It becomes inaccessible. Um, so I don't think decoherence is an argument against the possibility of a cosmic mind. Moreover, for even if there were a real loss of information because of decoherence,
Oh, that's like,
um,
oh, okay.
for you to construe that as an argument against the cosmic mind would require the assumption that any mind has to be unitary. And that's an assumption too. What defines a mind is the experiential nature of its contents. In other words, a mind is something that is subjective. It is something that there is something it is like to be a mind.
Yeah, so this is something I don't know if I would agree with. Like this, so he's saying there can't be creatures with minds that lack consciousness. I sort of know his background view that life and consciousness or something like that, they present the same appearance to us, or I don't know what's his way of putting it. That life is the appearance of a disassociated altar from across the barrier or something like that. I forget the exact way he would put it, but something that we would, a biopsychism in a more general context, that the living things are the ones that have consciousness. And I think that view is interesting, but the other view is that life is kind of a mechanical thing, so that simple single celled organisms don't have consciousness. And then you want to know where up the scale you go. Like, for example, I'll be talking with Michael Graziano on Monday. And in his book, he basically says, yeah, frogs, nope. They're not conscious. They're intelligent, but they're not conscious. According to him, you probably don't get consciousness until reptiles and then some birds and mammals. Dinosaurs get in there as a result. So that's cool. Lucky for them, I guess. Poor Triceratops being eaten by T-Rex has to feel all that suffering, I guess, if Graziano is right. Whereas, you know, giant frogs don't. What would they call? I know there's some prehistoric frog-like thing, amphibian. It doesn't matter. Anyway, the point is, I know that that's his view, but I don't really know what the evidence for that view is. I would like to believe it, but anyway, so we don't need to go into this too much, but it is interesting. I get what he's saying, that if you have, so decoherence is roughly thought that, you would, from the quantum state, you get this kind of interacting with the environment, and so you get mathematically, you get what kind of looks like a classical world emerging out of it, so to speak, and the superpositions fading away as the entanglement grows with the environment. I agree, it's just a mathematical trick, and that's not really there in, so to speak, a fundamental property of the world, perhaps. But I hadn't thought of this objection that if that was true, then there couldn't be a unified mind. I think he's right to point out that, especially on a view like his, if there's some cosmic mind that has a bunch of disassociations, then, this may be what you would kind of expect. So exactly what does count as a mind is an important point. The thing I was objecting to was just this question of whether you have to be conscious in order to count as having a mind. Whereas if you think that, the mental things are the things that have intentionality, so there's states that are about things in the world, and then maybe they even have mental qualities, like redness of red and stuff. But that if those things could be unconscious, then you could have a mind just composed of the unconscious parts. This was something that came up on a previous video discussion with Bernardo, where the question of whether there could be unconscious experience was being discussed. And Bernardo doesn't think that there is. So there could be stuff that's unconscious that you're not aware of, but that stuff would still be phenomenal, it'd be felt. Whereas on the other side, that stuff would be, psychological and maybe mental. Definitely mental if it's psychological, but it wouldn't be experienced. So there are two different views about the mind. And, Bernardo talks as though this is obvious, but I don't think it's that obvious. I think we need arguments. So far, we haven't seen the arguments for that, but here he was not trying to give that argument. He's addressing something else, so that's fine. Okay, let's continue.
Subjectivity is what defines it, not the inability to describe that mind as constituted of mental segments. And that's what decoherence would imply, that you could make partial descriptions of segments of that mind if there is real decoherence in the sense of loss of information. And then in one you would say, well, that's incompatible with the nature of a mind. Well, I would argue against that too. So that would be the second line of argument against this hypothesis that decoherence rules out a cosmic mind. You can have a mind that is not in a complete superposition. We call it a dissociated mind. And we know such things exist. Human beings can become dissociated. We are dissociated all the time. Every time you don't remember something, you are dissociated. And you can characterize these two sides of dissociation independently of one another. In other words, they don't need to be in a perfect superposition. So that would be the second argument. Now, a broader comment now, not necessarily an argument against this, but more generally speaking, information, pardon my English, information is a bitch. It's a very difficult concept in physics and information theory and mathematics. It's in some sense similar, well, it's very similar and related to the second law of thermodynamics. That is one of the most precarious ideas in physics. We can't even define it in a rigorous enough way, and yet it seems to be there. So when we speak of whether information is there or not, what we almost always mean by it is whether we can access the information or not. And that's different from whether there is information there or not. In the context of the second law of thermodynamics, if you have a cup of coffee and a cup of milk, you say, well, I discern the information there. One cup is black, the other cup is white. So there is a difference between the two states, and therefore there is information. But if I mix the two cups in a third, now I lost that information because now there is only brown, there is only one state. There aren't two discernible states anymore. So information has been lost. No, we cannot access that information anymore. But if I were a microscopic Maxwell demon, and I could dive into the cup with the mixed tea and coffee and start like a skier going downhill on a slalom, um, defining a boundary between every molecule of coffee and every molecule of milk in such a way that to my left there is a molecule of coffee and to my right there is a molecule of milk. And I would slalom down the entire cup in 3 dimensions, defining that boundary. I would have the two states. There would be coffee to one side and milk to the other. At a microscopic level, the information is still there, but we can't access it. So appeals to information, and especially to the disappearance of information, are pretty precarious because they are based on assumptions that do not have a rigorous formulation, let alone a rigorous substantiation.
Yeah,
You know,
interesting. Yeah, I think this is like sort of getting towards the black hole paradox and it's all that sort of stuff because of destruction of information. So that's interesting. I do want to stop this though, so I can get back and come back and listen to the stuff on Frankish and Dennett. But so far, this has been a very interesting interview.